Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things, and welcome to another video, and welcome to the final instalment of my guide to Victorian authors. Today I'm going to be telling you about Victorian authors from Bram Stoker to Israel Zangwill and many authors in between. So we will start off with Bram Stoker, who was born in 1847 and died in 1912. He was a writer from Dublin, born into an Anglo-Irish Protestant family, and although he is best known today as a novelist, he also began his career as a civil servant and later worked in the theatre world. So he was assistant to the famous actor Henry Irving, and later worked as a manager of a theatre in the West End of London. During his writing career, Bram Stoker wrote 12 novels as well as many short stories, and he is, as you probably know, most famous for his gothic vampire novel Dracula. I have only read Dracula by him. I haven't read any of the rest of his works, and I really don't like Dracula. It's one of those books that I don't like, and I studied it at A-level, so when I was sort of 17, 18 years old, and so I hate Dracula in the way that you can only hate a book that you didn't like and then had to read like 5 times in order to prepare for exams and write essays on it. Dracula, as you probably know, is a very famous vampire novel about a vampire called Dracula and various other characters. It's written in quite an interesting form, with lots of use of diaries and lots of different perspectives. I have read it many times, but not since I was about 17 or 18 years old, and I found the presentation of women in it and kind of all the gender politics of it absolutely infuriating. I feel like it's probably the kind of book that if I reread it now, I would still find it angering, but I'd probably find it angering in an interesting way. Whereas I feel like because I read it as a teenager and was forced to study it, that has made my hatred of it run very deep. But at some point I should give it another try, maybe. More importantly, I think I might give something else by Bram Stoker a try, and if I like that, I might return to Dracula. I think top of my list is probably The Snake's Pass, just because I quite like that title, so if you have any recommendations of where I should go next with Bram Stoker, do let me know. The next author I want to mention is Hesper Stratton. This was the pen name of Sarah Smith, who was born in 1832 and died in 1911. She was a novelist and short story writer from Shropshire who is best known as a children's author. She was an evangelical Christian and wrote quite a lot of heavily religious books for children. Her most famous book was called Jessica's First Prayer and was published in 1866, and it outsold Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. It was one of the most successful children's books of the Victorian period. Stratton was also a regular contributor to Charles Dickens's magazines, and contributed to some of the collaborative works that Dickens and Wilkie Collins kind of worked on together. I have read 1 or 2 short stories by her. Very recently I read a short story by her in the Dickens and Wilkie Collins and various other authors mashup, The Haunted House. I didn't love The Haunted House overall, but actually Hesper Stratton's story in it I did quite like, so maybe I should try something else by her. In general, she's not an author I'm hugely excited to read more from, but no doubt I will come across her work at some other point as I continue to read Dickens's sort of collaborative efforts with other writers. Next on my list is Arthur Sullivan, who was born in 1852 and died in 1900. He was a composer and writer from London, and he's best known as part of the duo Gilbert and Sullivan, who collaborated on many famous operettas during the 1870s, 1880s and 1890s. I spoke about William Gilbert earlier on in the week, and I spoke quite a bit more about Gilbert and Sullivan then, so I kind of won't repeat too much here. I was sort of umming and ahhing about whether or not I should include Arthur Sullivan in my list of authors, because as far as I can tell, I think in general Gilbert wrote the words and Sullivan wrote the music, but I do think that they both influenced both, and although like chiefly one was in charge of the words and one was in charge of the music, they did work very collaboratively on the operettas, so it's kind of hard to separate their influence entirely. I feel like if I had thought about it properly, I would have just spoken about them as one when I spoke about William Gilbert earlier in the week, but I didn't do that, so I thought I would just slip Arthur Sullivan in here. As I said earlier in the week, I have seen quite a few Gilbert and Sullivan operettas, and they are in general pretty good fun. Our next writer is a poet, and that is Algernon Charles Swinburne, who was born in 1837 and died in 1909. He was chiefly known as a poet, although he was also a playwright and literary critic. Within his poetry, Swinburne wrote wrote about quite a lot of taboo subjects, which caused a lot of controversy at the time. His poems deal with same-sex relationships. Some of his poems also look at sadomasochism. So there's quite a lot of unusual things in his poems. His early collection, Poems and Ballads from 1866, has a lot of poems in it inspired by Sappho and was hugely controversial when it was published. I've read quite a few poems by Swinburne, but generally sort of like in anthologies and collections, rather than sort of dedicating a lot of time to him. But I do want to read more by him. I'd be interested in reading his collection Songs Before Sunrise, mostly just because I really like that title. From what I remember, his style is quite unusual, like there's a lot of alliteration and quite rapid rhythm. So I think if you like a poet like Gerard Manley Hopkins, then it might be worth giving Swinburne a try too. As I said, he's best known for his poetry, but he also wrote some plays in verse, and he also wrote critical literary essays, including essays about William Blake, Charlotte Bronte, Shakespeare, Victor Hugo, and many others. The next writer I want to tell you about is John Addington Simmons, who was born in Bristol in 1840 and died in 1893. He was a non-fiction writer, a poet, and a cultural historian, and he was especially interested in what today we would call queer history. He recently came to my attention because he's one of the non-fiction writers who inspired Tom Cruise's book The New Life. So there's a character in The New Life called John Addington who is based on John Addington Simmons, although with some details of his life and work changed. John Addington Simmons is a really interesting historical figure. He wrote history books and literary criticism, and one of his most significant books at the time was a long series of books called Renaissance in Italy, which was basically an extended history book published in lots of different volumes talking about the Italian Renaissance. He also wrote a book called A Problem in Greek Ethics, which came out in 1883 and apparently was probably the book that introduced the term homosexuality to the English language, which is really interesting. Simmons was married with children, but he also had relationships with men, and as I said, he wrote quite a lot of work about sexuality and the history of sexuality. I would be really interested in reading some of his non-fiction work. I think probably especially something like A Problem in Greek Ethics, because I'm really interested in queer history and also like in the history of history. Like I'm always interested in how people from the past understood their own past. That's something I always find fascinating. So I should pick up some John Addington Simmons at some point, and maybe I should try some of his poetry too. The next writer I want to talk about is Harriet Taylor Mill. She was born in 1807 and died in 1858. She was a philosopher and non-fiction writer who fought for women's rights, and she was also married to John Stuart Mill, who we spoke about earlier in the week. John Stuart Mill was her second husband. Her first husband was called Taylor, and she is often known now as Harriet Taylor Mill. I have read bits and pieces of her work, most notably The Enfranchisement of Women from 1851. I mostly read extracts and essays by her when I was studying Victorian social history at university, and she's a really interesting writer. The next author I want to tell you about is Tom Taylor, who was a playwright, journalist and critic from Sunderland. He was born in 1817 and died in 1880, and he had quite a varied career. He briefly worked as a lawyer, then as a civil servant, and then as a journalist, and he ended up being the editor of Punch magazine. He wrote a lot of plays, usually farces and melodramas, many of which were adaptations of French plays. So he would, take a French play and adapt it and rework it for the British stage, often changing the setting to England instead. The only thing I've read by him is a play called The Ticket of Leave Man from 1863, which is a very, very silly melodrama about a young man and his efforts to find gainful employment after he has been in prison. I thought it was really great. It's very silly and over the top, but in a really fun way, and kind of beneath the silliness, there are a few really serious social critique themes that I thought were handled really well. So that's made me quite keen to read more by Tom Taylor. One of his most famous plays is his play Our American Cousin from 1858, but it's chiefly famous for being the play that Abraham Lincoln was seeing when he was assassinated. So a very unusual reason for a work of literature to be famous, but maybe I'll read that one at some point soon. Our next author is one of the most successful poets of the Victorian period, and that is Alfred Tennyson, who was born in 1809 and died in 1892. Just to explain, Tennyson is sometimes referred to as Alfred Tennyson and sometimes as Alfred Lord Tennyson. So basically he was born Alfred Tennyson, that was his name, and then in 1884 he was presented with a peerage, he became a baron, and as a baron his title was Tennyson and he would be addressed as Lord Tennyson. But obviously he was very well known as a poet as Alfred Tennyson, so rather than people just calling him Lord Tennyson, sometimes he gets referred to as Alfred, Lord Tennyson. I think at some point soon I might do a video on titles and address and like how to understand the British peerage if you're someone who reads a lot of 19th century literature. Maybe I'll do that at some point soon. I feel like that would be useful for people. Anyway, Tennyson is probably the most famous poet of the Victorian period. He was hugely successful. His first poetry collection was published in 1830 when he was just 21, and he went on to have a really successful career. He was made poet laureate in 1850 and held the position until his death in 1892. So he was poet laureate for like the majority of the Victorian period. He wrote a lot of famous poems that you have probably heard of and possibly read: Mariana, The Lady of Shalott, The Charge of the Light Brigade. He's also well known for his longer poem on grief, In Memoriam, from which we get the common expression, "'Tis better to have loved and lost than never to have loved at all." I have read all of the things that I just mentioned, plus various other poems. I didn't actually love In Memoriam as much as I was expecting to. Like, I did find parts of it really moving, but in general I didn't love it as much as I thought I would. But I do love a lot of his shorter works, and my favourite poem by him is probably Mariana, which is a poem inspired by a character from Shakespeare's play Measure for Measure. The next author I want to tell you about is William Makepeace Thackeray. Thackeray was born in 1811 and died in 1863. He was actually born in India, where his father was working for the East India Company, but he was sent to England after his father's death when he was just 4 years old. Thackeray was a hugely popular and highly regarded author during the Victorian period. He remains a pretty famous author, I would say, but mostly for his novel Vanity Fair. I feel like a lot of the rest of his books have been fairly forgotten. He wrote historical fiction, social critique novels, and he considered himself a realist writer and tried to distance himself from some of the more like melodramatic, sentimental stuff in the Victorian period. He wrote 12 full-length novels, as well as a lot of novellas and some non-fiction and poetry as well. I have read 2 of his books, Vanity Fair from 1848 and Barry Lyndon from 1844. I read Vanity Fair as a teenager and I really liked it, but I didn't like it so much that I felt the need to read everything else that he'd ever written, as I did with many other Victorian authors who I first discovered as a teenager. I don't remember it that well, and I would quite like to reread it sometime, just because, yeah, it's been a very long time. And then I read Barry Lyndon a couple of years ago, and I really didn't like it, so that sort of made me not really know where to go next with Thackeray. I just didn't get on with this one at all. I feel like there were some things in it that were really interesting, but I just disliked the main character so much, and maybe I was meant to, but I just found myself so annoyed with him throughout the novel. So there we go. Anyway, I do want to read some more by him. One book I'd be quite interested to read is The Rose and the Ring from 1854, which is a satirical work of fantasy fiction, so that sounds pretty fun. And then I would also quite like to read his Christmas book, Mrs. Perkins' Ball from 1846, which is meant to be really fun. Then the next author on our list is actually William Makepeace Thackeray's daughter, Anne Thackeray Richie, who was born in 1837 and died in 1919. She wrote novels and short stories, including some fairy tales, and it sounds like she wrote like the Victorian equivalent of a modern fairy tale retelling, like taking fairy tales and folk stories and setting them like firmly in the Victorian period, which I think sounds fascinating. So I really want to read some of her fairy stories. She has a collection from 1874, Bluebeard's Keys and other stories, so I might start there. She's not an author I know a huge amount about, but she sounds really interesting. The next author I want to tell you about is Brandon Thomas. His full name was Walter Brandon Thomas, and he was born in 1848 and died in 1914, and he was an actor and playwright from Liverpool who wrote more than a dozen plays. In his work as an actor, he also worked with a lot of other well-known Victorian playwrights, including Dion Boucicault and Arthur Wynne Pinero, both of whom I spoke about earlier in the week. Brandon Thomas is definitely best known for his farce Charlie's Aunt, which was first performed in 1892 and broke historic records for the longest running show at the time. Its London run was 1,466 performances, and it was hugely successful and has gone on to be really successful. I love Charlie's Aunt. I think it's really fun. It is a very silly and delightful play that does a lot of clever things beneath the silliness of its surface. Basically, in this play, we're following a few young men who are at university, and Charlie's aunt is coming to visit, and Charlie and his friend Jack think this is a great excuse to get the 2 young women that they're in love with to come round. Charlie's aunt can be the chaperone, and that'll make everything respectable. But then Charlie's aunt telegraphs to say that she can't come, and so they persuade one of their university friends to dress up as Charlie's aunt. But the play goes in lots of different directions and does more interesting and complicated things with that setup and with like gender roles within the Victorian period in just a really interesting way. And I just thought it was great, so I really recommend this, and I should should definitely try and read something else by Brandon Thomas at some point in the future. And now we're on to the Trollop family. I have many members of the Trollop family to introduce you to. I was gonna do it in alphabetical order, and then I thought like the relations between everyone would just be confusing. So instead we are gonna start with Frances Trollop, and then we'll talk about her sons later. So Frances Milton Trollop, sometimes also published under the name Fanny Trollop, was a successful novelist and non-fiction writer from sort of slightly before the Victorian period into the Victorian period. She became successful when her first non-fiction book, Domestic Manners of the Americans, was published in 1832. She wrote that after she had spent a few years living in America, and apparently it is highly critical of the United States. After that, she went on to write more non-fiction and novels, including a lot of social critique novels. She wrote 2 novels that were very sort of influential in terms of social thought at the time, one of which was Jonathan Jefferson Whitlaw from 1836, which is considered one of the first anti-slavery novels. And then she also published an industrial novel, Michael Armstrong the Factory Boy, in 1840, which was all about children working in factories, and this novel was really instrumental in changing people's minds and ensuring that new legislation came in about children working in factories. So she was a very influential figure in her time. I have read 2 of her books, Michael Armstrong, which I just spoke about, which I really enjoyed, and also Widow Barnaby from 1839. Both of those books I thought were great, and I really want to read more by her. I think she's a really great author. Top of my list are probably Jessie Phillips, A Tale of the Present Day from 1842, which is a novel about workhouses, another social critique novel. I think that'll be really interesting. And I'd also quite like to read The Vicar of Wrexhill from 1837, which is apparently the tale of a shady clergyman. So doesn't that sound interesting? In general, Frances Trollop is just a really interesting author and definitely someone I need to read more by. And then next, let's talk about her son and one of my favourite authors ever, the wonderful Anthony Trollope. Anthony Trollope was born in London in 1815 and died in 1882, and he was a very important and very prolific Victorian novelist and short story writer. Anthony Trollope, Charles Dickens and Elizabeth Gaskell are my favourite 3 Victorian authors, and Anthony Trollope is absolutely up there as one of my favourite authors of all time. Like, do I love him as much as Charles Dickens? Maybe. I just think he's incredible. I think he's probably also the Victorian author I've read the most from, because he wrote a lot of books and I have read quite a lot of them. We'll talk about that in a minute. Let's talk a bit more about his life first. For his day job, Anthony Trollope was a civil servant, and he mostly worked in the postal service. In fact, through his work in the civil service, Anthony Trollope was partly responsible for the spread of the postbox and the wide usage of the postbox, so I think that's really cool. Anthony Trollope spent most of his life in England, but he also lived in Ireland for several years, and a few of his books are set in Ireland. Anthony Trollope wrote, I guess, chiefly domestic realism. There are a lot of marriage plots in his novels, lots of love triangles and inheritance disputes. His characterization is absolutely magnificent. Like, I feel like he writes characters so well, and often really complicatedly. Like, no one is ever simply good or bad in an Anthony Trollope novel. There are so many characters who you just want to be slightly better than they are, and it's so well done. He also writes in this wonderful, like, confiding way, like he's telling you a story and he'll comment on his own choice of hero or heroine, or comment on his own narrative in just this really delightful way. I just feel like he's a really trustworthy author who I just absolutely love. He is best known, I'd say, for his 2 big series of interconnected novels, The Barsetshire Chronicles, which is a series of 6 interconnected books all set in the same fictional county, and also the Palliser books, or the parliamentary novels, a series of 6 books, all of which are kind of about politics and parliament, and many of which follow a family called the Pallisers. He also wrote a lot of standalone books as well, and he was in general very prolific. In fact, Anthony Trollope wrote 47 novels, along with some non-fiction, chiefly travel writing, I think, and an autobiography, and also various short stories. As I said, Anthony Trollope wrote 47 novels, and I have, at this point that I'm filming, read 37 and 2/3. So I'm 2/3 the way through 1 book at the moment, and I have already read 37, which is quite a lot of books. I think that alone tells you how much I love love Anthony Trollope. I'm hoping that I will finish the book I'm currently reading imminently and then read the last 9 novels I have to read by him in the next year, and also his autobiography, and also reread a couple that I haven't read for ages. I want to read all of Anthony Trollope's novels, and not just like one day, I mean like really soon. Few things bring me as much joy in life as reading an Anthony Trollope novel. I'm going to briefly give my top 5 Anthony Trollope books. I feel like the top 3 stay relatively stable, but the others change around a lot. Currently, I would put at number 5, Ralph the Heir, at number 4, Isola's Angel, at number 3, Dr. Wurtle's School, and then kind of in joint first and second place, I don't know how to decide between them, we'll put The Way We Live Now and The Small House at Allington, both of which I just absolutely adore so much. In terms of where to start with Anthony Trollope, I think Dr. Wurtle's School is not a terrible place to start. It's quite short and focused. I would also say that Ralph the Heir or The Claverings or The Vicar of Bullhampton are all pretty decent places to start with Anthony Trollope. I've made plenty of videos about Anthony Trollope before, so I will leave some link down below, including my tips for Anthony Trollope video and my individual book reviews of all the books in the Barsetshire Chronicles. I might have also done individual book reviews for all the novels in the Palliser series. I can't remember, but if I have done, I'll link them down below. Then next, another member of the Trollope family, we have Thomas Adolphus Trollope, who was Anthony Trollope's elder brother. He was born in 1810 and died in 1892. In general, he was fairly overshadowed in his literary career by his younger brother, but he did write quite a lot of books. He wrote a lot of non-fiction history books, as well as some travel writing and some novels. I've yet to read anything by Thomas Adolphus Trollope. I kind of would like to, but I feel like I'm definitely only drawn towards his books because I love his brother's books so much. But maybe when I've read everything by Anthony Trollope, I will progress to the rest of the Trollope family. I'm most curious to read his novel, The Garstangs of Garstang Grange from 1869. I think I'm mostly drawn towards that one because the title just sounds really like an Anthony Trollope title, but there we go. Thomas Adolphus Trollope was married twice. After his first wife's death, he married his second wife, Frances Ellena Trollope, and we're going to talk about her next. So Frances Ellena Trollope was born in 1835 and died in 1913. Her maiden name was Ternan, and if the name Ternan sounds at all familiar to you, then yes. Frances Ellena Ternan, later Frances Ellena Trollope, was the sister of Ellen Ternan, who was Charles Dickens's partner later on in life. And in fact, it's all related because after the death of Thomas Adolphus Trollope's first wife, he was looking for a governess for his children, and Charles Dickens knew that his partner's sister was looking for a position as a governess and so recommended her, and so Frances Ellena Ternan went to work in Thomas Trollope's house as a governess and ended up marrying him. Frances Ellena Trollope wrote 12 novels, as well as a biography of her mother, Frances Milton Trollope, which was kind of the book she was best known for. I have not yet read anything by her. Actually, that's not true. I have read the one chapter that she wrote in The Fate of Fenella, which is a collaborative Victorian work. I liked her one chapter. There were a few chapters within The Fate of Fenella where I was like, this author is much less talented than the other authors. But Frances Ellena Trollope's chapter was not one of those, so I'm excited to read more by her. I'd be quite interested to read That Unfortunate Marriage from 1888 because what a great title. Our next author is Mary Augusta Ward, who is often published under the name Mrs. Humphrey Ward. She was born in 1851 and died in 1920. She was actually born in Australia, but her family moved to England when she was about 5 years old, and she spent the rest of her life there. She has a lot of literary relations. So she was the niece of the poet Matthew Arnold, who we spoke about earlier in the week, and she was also the aunt of Aldous Huxley, the author of Brave New World. So small literary world. Every now and then I do just think about like how intermarried the kind of like upper and upper middle classes were in the Victorian period, and actually like most of the reason why a lot of these authors were related to each other was kind of to do with like cultural privilege and cultural capital. But anyway, Mary Augusta Ward is an author who I've yet to read anything by, but I've heard good things about her novels Marcella and Ellena, so I should try and read something by her at some point. She wrote many novels, 9 of them during the Victorian period in the 1880s and 1890s, and then several more in the 20th century. She also wrote some non-fiction, a lot of which was on women's rights or not, as the case may be. So she had mixed views about the rights of women. Earlier on in her life, she co-founded the Association for the Education of Women, which was a book to promote women going to study at Oxford. But later on in life, she was the president of the Women's Anti-Suffrage League, and she wrote a lot of work criticising the suffragettes in the 1900s and 1910s. So that makes me slightly less excited to read her work, but there we go. Next up is another very significant author of the Victorian period, and that is H.G. Wells. H.G. Wells was born in 1866 and died in 1946, and he is a very well-known late 19th and early 20th century author, best known for his science fiction, although he also wrote a lot of realist work too, which is less known, but really, really good. Having just said that a lot of Victorian authors were interconnected because they were all from a particular class, H.G. Wells was not. He was from a working class background. He was the son of servants turned shopkeepers, and a lot of his realist works deal with themes of class in a really interesting way. He started off his career as a draper's apprentice before eventually winning a scholarship to study biology. His first published book was a non-fiction biology book, but after that he went on to write fiction, often science fiction. Actually, so far I like his realist work more than his science fiction work, which I feel is quite an unusual opinion, but I just think he writes about class in the most interesting way. So far I've read 8 of his novels as well as some short stories. So I've read 4 of his science fiction works from the 1890s. So The Time Machine from 1895, which is a really great short time travel novel. I'd probably recommend that as the best place to start with H.G. Wells. I've also read The Island of Dr. Moreau from 1896, The Invisible Man from 1897, and The War of the Worlds from 1898. And I've also read some of his short stories in this little collection here, A Slip Under the Microscope. And then when it comes to his realist works, the 2 from the Victorian period I've read are The Wheels of Chance from 1896 and Love and Mr. Lewisham from 1900. And then I've also read 2 of his Edwardian realist books, Kipps and The History of Mr. Polly. So far, my favourite thing I've ever read by H.G. Wells is Love and Mr. Lewisham, a wonderful novel about class and love and social mobility from 1900. It's so fantastic and I really recommend it. I think The Time Machine is probably the place to start with his science fiction, but I think Love and Mr. Lewisham is the place to start with his realist works, and I just thought it was wonderful. I really want to read more by H.G. Wells, both his realist works and his science fiction. I think the other 2 science fiction books by him I'm most keen to read are The Men in the Moon from 1901 and The Sleeper Awakes from 1899. But I do just in general need to read more by him. I feel like he's an author who I really love, but it's been like a couple of years since I last read anything new by him, so I really must do that at some point soon. The next author I want to talk about is the wonderful Oscar Wilde. Oscar Wilde was born in 1854 and died in 1900. He was born in Dublin to an Anglo-Irish family, and he was a poet, a playwright, a novelist, and a short story writer. He was hugely talented and wrote a lot of different things in various different genres. He is probably best known, I would say, for his novel The Picture of Dorian Gray, although a lot of his plays, especially The Importance of Being Earnest, are very famous too. He was part of the aesthetic movement, and he's also well known for his very sharp wit. He's also known for his sexuality. He was married, but we know he had relationships with men, and he was convicted for gross indecency, or in other words, having sexual relationships with men later on in his life. His trial in the 1890s was very famous and very influential in terms of how sexuality was thought about in the Victorian period. Oscar Wilde is a truly wonderful writer, and I have read a lot of different bits and pieces by him. So I've read his novel The Picture of Dorian Gray several times. I think it is truly, truly fantastic. This is a wonderful, gothic, mysterious novel from 1891 about a young man who kind of sells his soul. It's just fantastic. I've also read a lot of his short stories. I've got a little collection here, Lord Arthur Saville's Crime. I've also read quite a few of his other short stories for adults and also quite a lot of his fairy tales. I also absolutely love his long short story novella, whatever it may be, The Canterville Ghost, which is a hilarious but also kind of moving tale of a ghost who really wants to haunt this house and no one cares that he's haunting them. It's just absolutely delightful. I've also read quite a lot of his poetry, including his long poem The Ballad of Reading Gaol. I've also read some of his non-fiction. He wrote a really interesting essay, The Soul of Man Under Socialism, which is all about how he envisaged the world changing under socialism and how people would have more time to be more creative because machines would do more of the work, which is one of those really interesting Victorian essays that I feel is still like really interesting to look at from a modern perspective in terms of how technology has changed life now. I've also read quite a lot of his plays: Lady Windermere's Fan, A Woman of No Importance, Salome, The Importance of Being Earnest, An Ideal Husband, A Florentine Tragedy. My favourite is probably Lady Windermere's Fan, though I really love The Importance of Being Earnest as well. I think Oscar Wilde is an absolutely fantastic playwright. Like, I love The Picture of Dorian Gray and I love his prose, but his plays are just so good. Like, I think I rate him most of all as just like the best dramatist of the Victorian period. I'm sure George Bernard Shaw would want to dispute that title, but I just think Oscar Wilde was such a talented playwright. His wit and his dialogue and his characterization is so great. A Woman of No Importance is this wonderful play that really like pulls apart Victorian ideas about gender and double standards, and it's just so good. I would also say that because Oscar Wilde's plays are so sort of witty and so much of it is about the words, like they work really well read. You know, some plays I think are much more impactful when you see them live, but I think Oscar Wilde's plays work really well read as well. As I said, I have read a lot of stuff by Oscar Wilde, but there are still bits and pieces for me left to read. I think there are probably some short stories of his that I haven't read, and I'd be interested to read De Profundis, which is a long letter he wrote to his lover, Lord Alfred Douglas, about his experiences through his criminal trial, and I will be really interested to read that at some point in the future. It's meant to be very moving and very powerful, so that is definitely on my list. Our next author is Ellen Wood, also often published under the name Mrs. Henry Wood. She was born in 1814 and died in 1887, and she was a sensation writer from Worcestershire who was hugely successful in the Victorian period. She was really successful in Britain, but she was also hugely successful in the US and in Australia as well. Ellen Wood took up writing after her husband's business failed, and she supported her husband and 4 children off the proceeds of her writing. She wrote over 30 novels, chiefly in the sensation genre, and she also ran the literary magazine Argosy. I have only read one book by her, this one, East Lynne, which I absolutely loved. This is a wonderful sensation novel. It has everything you want in sensation fiction. It has a murder, it has adultery, it has running away, it has disguises and mysteries, and it's just really great fun. Like, I really recommend it. It was so good. One of my favorite sensation novels that I've read. I read this quite a few years ago and I still haven't read anything more by her, so I definitely need to. I think top of my list is probably The Shadow of Ashley Diet from 1863, which I've heard some interesting things about, but I just really need to read some more by her. The next author I want to talk about is Miss X, which was the pseudonym for Ada Goodrich Freer. She was born in 1857 and died in 1931. She was a writer, but she was chiefly known as a medium and a clairvoyant, and she was apparently cast out from society after she was caught defrauding people at a seance. She was born in England, but after she was cast out from society, she later moved abroad and ended up in the US. And I'd be really interested to read her book, The Professional and Other Psychic Stories from 1900. And I just feel like reading something by someone who was like known as a medium would be really kind of fascinating. Did I initially put Miss X in this list because I thought it'd be fun to have an author for every letter in the alphabet and that I wouldn't find anyone else with a surname beginning with X? Yes, possibly. Did I then realise I didn't actually have any authors whose surnames began with U or V? Yes, but that's fine. We have Miss X in here. She sounds like a fascinating figure, so I thought it would be nice to include her anyway. The next author I want to talk about is W.B. Yates, born in 1865 and he died in 1939. He is a very well-known Irish poet who was born to an Anglo-Irish Protestant family. He is usually thought of as a 20th century poet, but actually he lived a lot of his life in the Victorian period too, and a few of his first collections came out in the 1880s and 1890s. He also published some Irish fairy tales and folk tales during the 1880s, which is really interesting. I have read some of his poems, but not that many. I would like to read more at some point, and I'd be interested to read some of his folk tales too. And then our next author, in fact our penultimate author, is Charlotte Mary Young. She was born in 1823 and died in 1901, and she is a novelist best known for her domestic realism. She wrote a lot of novels. Like, I think she wrote over 160 works, and most of them are novels, though some of them are shorter things too. As well as being a novelist, she also was the founder and editor of the literary magazines The Monthly Packet, and throughout the Victorian period she was very successful, very widely read. I feel like Charlotte Mary Young is one of those authors who has been generally forgotten by like the canon, but the people who love her books really love her books. I have only read one work by her, and that is The Heir of Redcliffe from 1853, which I found really interesting and I did really like, but I also feel like having read one of her books I would now like more books by her more, if that makes sense. Like, I feel like for the first half of The Heir of Redcliffe, I was like, I don't exactly know what to expect here. I don't know what kind of book this is yet. Whereas now that I have read The Heir of Redcliffe, I feel like, one, I will appreciate The Heir of Redcliffe more on a reread, but also I will appreciate anything else I read by Charlotte Mary Young more. I'm going to direct you to Kate Howe's channel. Kate Howe, my Victober co-host, recently did a video ranking a lot of Charlotte Mary Young's books. She has read a lot of Charlotte Mary Young and knows her work much better than I do. I was watching that video, just making a note of all the Charlotte Mary Young books I want to read. I've heard really good things about Cantry House, which is a ghost story, and I've also heard great things about The Three Brides, which Kate was just raving about. It's a story of three brothers who come home to look after their mother, and about the three new wives that they bring with them. Charlotte Mary Young writes quite a lot about disability, and I know that that theme features in Three Brides as well as in The Daisy Chain, which I'd be quite interested to read. In Kate's video, she said that a good place to start with Charlotte Mary Young would be Dine of a Terrorist, so I'm going to recommend that as a place to start. I would say probably don't start with The Heir of Redcliffe, because as I said, I just feel like I spent the first half being like, I just don't know what kind of book this is. I don't know if that makes any sense, but I just couldn't quite get like a handle on The Heir of Redcliffe until like the second half, and then I started to understand the point and like who I was meant to sympathise with. I feel like I spent the first half of the book sympathising with the characters that Charlotte Mary Young didn't want me to sympathise with, and therefore I like wasn't quite in the position that she wanted me to be in. So I feel like it's not necessarily the best place to start with her books, though I did really like it by the end. And anyway, I definitely need to read some more by her at some point in the future. And then the final author in my guide to Victorian authors for now is Israel Zangwill, who was born in 1864 and died in 1926. He was born in Whitechapel in London. His parents were Jewish immigrants from the Russian Empire, and throughout his books, Zangwill wrote quite a lot about the Jewish experience in the 19th century. He was also an active social reformer, and I'm really interested to read some of his work. Specifically, the book by him I've had on my radar for ages is Children of the Ghetto from 1892. That's a book I definitely want to read at some point soon. So there we go. We have finally got to the end of my guide to Victorian authors. I hope you have enjoyed being introduced to 150 authors. In fact, really 152, because I put George and Weedon Grossmith together as one, and I also put Michael Field, who was the pseudonym for two people, together as one. I have read 101 out of the 150 authors, or I guess 102 out of the 152 authors. So I've read just over 2/3 of these authors. Obviously, some of those authors who I've read one book by and need to read a lot more by. And yeah, there are also a lot more authors that I need to get to that I'm excited to read at some point in the future. I hope you have enjoyed this series. It has been really fun to make, and I have discovered a lot more about a lot of Victorian authors that I had read from, and also discovered so many more Victorian authors that I want to read from. I know there have been some gaps and omissions. I already have a list of like 5 authors who I didn't include, including J.M. Barrie. How did I forget J.M. Barrie? He is so famous. Like, I know he is mostly famous for being an Edwardian writer, but I know that he wrote stuff in the Victorian period. Anyway, that's fine. I will at some point do a like catch up leftover Victorian authors video that I will like put on to the end of the playlist and post like at some point next year. When I have a list of like 10 Victorian authors that I didn't include in this video, I'll make like a bonus one and add this on to the end of the list, because I'm sure I will keep finding Victorian authors who I haven't heard of before. I hope that this series has been and will continue to be a useful reference for people who are interested in Victorian literature and in finding out more about Victorian authors. This series has been massive fun to make, as I said, but it has also been very time consuming. So if you enjoyed this series, please do consider supporting me on Patreon or leaving me a tip through SuperThanks, which is the little button beneath this video. I will leave details about my Patreon down below. No pressure as ever, but if you ever feel like giving me a tip, then that would be very nice. Anyway, thank you so much for watching this very long series. I hope that it has been enjoyable. Do let me know down in the comments, have you heard of any of today's authors? Have you read anything by them? Do you have any extra recommendations or any extra authors for me to add to my overspill list? Thanks so much for watching, and I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.